Josh.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Okay. Well, welcome, folks. We'll get started in 2 minutes. Thanks for joining us tonight. So grab yourself your tea or your water or whatever. Okay, wonderful. Well, let's get rolling. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Evan Manville. I am a land use and transportation planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We're here tonight both to explain what we're trying to do with our climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking, and to hear from you about what you think about what we're doing and how we should adjust it before those rules are adopted, hopefully in May of next year. So thank you all for being here tonight. You can see the meetings being recorded. You'll be on mute if you need until we're done presenting. If you need something, you're welcome to chat at us. We've got lots of staff on the call that you can chat to, that chat at the co-hosts, and someone can help you. Once again, thank you. I will turn the microphone over to Commissioner Warren, who has joined the Land Conservation Development Commission last year, and we threw him in at the deep end, co-leading this rulemaking, which is a very heavy lift, and we really appreciate his commitment to this rulemaking and his engagement throughout the process. So, Commissioner Warren.
Yes, thank you, Evan, and thank you everyone here for being here tonight. It's a really important part of the process. I really feel like community involvement in this process has been really great. In fact, this is our second set of community conversations so far. And what we're really looking for is kind of your wisdom and your engagement, and then any input you might have. On top of doing these community conversations, we've also convened a 50-person rulemaking advisory committee, which has worked incredibly hard, and we're so very grateful for all of their work on these rules. So up to this point, we've been doing this rulemaking effort for a year, and we have 6 months more to go. So thanks for staff for hanging in there on this long one. And then hopefully, if all the rules and everything go as planned, we'll be looking for adoption on the commission in May of 2022. When we first started this rulemaking, it was a really broad approach. We kind of started with an outcomes-based approach, and that was kind of in our first community conversation meeting last spring. And we kind of showed you what our equitable outcome statement was, and have been using that as guidance ever since then. We expect the climate-friendly and equitable community rules to significantly change current rules. That's kind of been the point of doing this whole thing, and really the drive from the commission. And we have gotten in fact, we've heard a lot of feedback since kind of this draft rules have come out. We've heard a lot of really positives, and we've heard a lot of things that people are concerned about. But we really need to make some significant changes here. And we need it for climate, we need it for housing, and we need it for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we really feel pretty strongly that a lot of the rules and the current draft rules will do that. But we also acknowledge that it's going to create a significant amount of staff time for our cities to really bring their current land use codes up to par with these rules. But luckily, we've identified some great resources from different state agencies that will help with that effort. As an Alameda fire survivor, I've definitely felt the impacts of climate. Last year was a pretty intense time in Southern Oregon, as most of you know. I've watched how the fires impacted Latinx communities inequitably, and I've personally got to help low and no income folks meet their basic needs of food, water, and survival after the fire. So I really feel strongly that it's time for a change, and some significant change. And on top of that, this change is not going to be easy, and we really, really understand that. But with that being said, we really need to take this time to unite, and we need to take the time to engage all of you. And so we're so thankful for you all coming here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Really appreciate that. So as Commissioner Warren noted, we're here because we're in a climate crisis, and we're failing to meet our goals to address that climate crisis. Oregon set up some goals for reducing climate pollution from all different sources, including transportation, and we're making significant progress on a lot of those, but we're not making very much progress on transportation. And so you can kind of see the gap here of where we were hoping to be and where we're expected to be. We're expected to have kind of 4 times as much transportation pollution as we want by 2050 if current trends continue. So we need to change what we're doing. We'd adopted something called the statewide transportation strategy, but we haven't fully implemented that. So we are suffering personally, our economy and our families, through extreme weather events, and we're expecting those will be more frequent and more extreme if we can't bend this curve. The second key driver of this rulemaking is inequity. And both private and public forces over the years have created a lot of inequity. This is a map of redlining, but it could very well be a map of zoning that kind of followed in the footsteps of redlining to encase wealth upon privileged folks, white folks, certain folks, and to limit the wealth that BIPOC communities and other underserved populations could have. And you see that that housing wealth in particular passes down generationally, and we're seeing the impacts generation upon generation. Even if redlining was outlawed, the housing wealth that was passed down, we see that outcome today. And white households have roughly 10 times on average the wealth as the average Black household. The third driver is just saying, hey, we've got different families and demographics and trends. When a lot of our zoning and land use laws started out, nuclear families were the dominant form of households, and not very many single person households. And those have kind of flipped over the last 40, 50 years. And now only about 1 in 5 households is nuclear family, while about a third of households are single person. So we've got different needs, and our land use planning and transportation planning should meet those changing needs. So under that context, Governor Brown did lay down Executive Order 2004, our climate executive order, and she kind of told the state agencies, a broad variety of state agencies, to really lean in on climate and to work harder to meet Oregon's climate pollution reduction goals. Within that order, she also said that we needed to prioritize equity, underserved populations, specifically historically marginalized communities, and do better to address the inequities and the discrimination, both historic and current. The nice thing about all that is we can have a really positive outcome, as much as that those are really challenging things to take on. The outcome, if we do it right, is a more equitable, cleaner future, and the sorts of communities that people find very pleasant in general. this is McMinnville's current downtown. So we have a lot of the stuff that works as far as climate friendly and equitable communities. We just need more of it. And I would say that generally the rulemaking is just hoping that about a third of people live in this sort of area and we could meet our climate goals. If more want to live there, great, but people may choose to live somewhere else. But we need more of this. We don't need 100% of Oregonians living in a place like this. The rulemaking was set up to really target where most Oregonians live and where we can have the biggest bang for our buck. The 8 metropolitan areas. Outside of those areas, the rulemaking is not having significant changes to the rules. So we're here, and these are the other metro areas of over 50,000 people. As Commissioner Warren noted, we have a large and diverse advisory committee, both with directs and alternates. We do have over 50 people. There are people from all 8 of those metro areas who've been advising us throughout this rulemaking. But we really worked hard to invest and make sure that we had some voices that aren't traditionally around the table, who may not have lobbyists, but kind of more community-based organizations, people of color, people with disabilities, people representing people experiencing homelessness, et cetera, really trying to make the committee reflect the diversity of Oregon overall. And they've been super helpful. The commission, when it adopted a charge, which I emailed out to folks who pre-registered, said, hey, we want you to do 2 main things in this rulemaking. The first is to work with regions so regions can plan and set up their regional plan to meet their pollution reduction targets. And the second is to kind of update Oregon's core land use and transportation rules, in 6 areas. And we'll go into detail about these areas, but the first is kind of setting up those climate friendly areas, kind of like McMinnville's downtown. Reform parking management, support EV charging, really improve transportation options for people. Get beyond solely focusing on motor vehicle congestion standards and prioritizing and selecting transportation projects that will collectively meet climate and equity outcomes. So those are the 2 threads of the rulemaking. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Cody Meyer.
Thank you, Evan. Good evening, everyone. I'm Cody Meyer, a land use and transportation planner with DLCD. So for our regional approach to some of this work really stems from the fact that we have regional greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state's metropolitan areas you saw on that map earlier. For the big metropolitan areas like Portland and Eugene, Springfield, and Salem, Kaiser, we're going to do what's called a scenario plan for the region, which kind of comes together with a regional vision for how that region wants to work together to reduce greenhouse gases to meet that target. For the other metropolitan areas, we are using the information we've had in the statewide transportation strategy since 2013 that really shows us where regions need to be at across a range of actions to reach the climate goals. So these are kind of like default levels of ambition for transit or bike ped mode share or mixed use development. And so what we're looking at is kind of a regional report that would set kind of a report card for the cities in the region to say, here's where more work can be put into it. We've been doing this work voluntarily for years. And in fact, we've done what's called a strategic assessment of plans down in Southern Oregon back in 2016 with the MPO down there. And we're going to use that information to identify the gaps between where the local plans are and where they need to be to reach their climate equity goals. So that really just kind of sets the framework for where local plans need to be changed, like a comprehensive plan or a transportation element to a comprehensive plan. Then on a 4 to 5 year cycle, I think for your area, it'd be a 5-year cycle. We're asking for plans to be updated, but also just corrective actions to be flagged. Where are we falling short? Where do we need to pick up the slack? Is it, and getting more people in mixed use development? What are the things we could do? Then across the 4 years, we're expected to see plans change and things being implemented. And then just back to the top is just evaluating where that gap is, and did things happen or did they not happen across each range of action? And so that'll just be kind of a reporting and monitoring framework to help course correct for local governments and give them and the public an idea of where things are heading in the right direction, where things could use more work, and hopefully making a business case for investments in areas that need more work. So next I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to talk a little bit about our climate-friendly areas.
Thanks, Cody. My name is Kevin Young. I'm one of the project managers for this effort, and I'll be talking with you about the climate-friendly area requirements. And just so you know, this is actually the second draft of the rules that I'll be speaking to. So we just released on Friday the packet for the next rulemaking advisory committee meeting with a whole bunch of rules, which we're speaking about today. But the climate-friendly area regulations is kind of the next version 2.0, if you will. We released the first set in August, and we got quite a bit of feedback from folks. And generally, I think the feedback we heard was kind of in a few different areas. One was concern about the timelines, which, the implementation timelines were relatively quick, and understandably so. We have been charged with acting with some urgency on climate. But so that was one of the issues we've heard about. The other one had to do with standards being overly prescriptive. And the third maybe big issue that we heard had to do with urban growth boundaries and the proposal we had for urban growth boundaries. So I'll speak to each of those three issues as I go through these standards. But in summary, what you'll see with this version are kind of a phased implementation timeline. You will see prescriptive standards, but also an alternative path for local governments, which I'll talk through, and then a kind of a different approach to urban growth boundaries. But let's begin at the beginning with this slide. What is a climate-friendly area? And fundamentally, these 4 bullets really describe what we're trying to accomplish in climate-friendly areas. And actually, the last bullet is the most important. Really, fundamentally, these areas need to be people-oriented and not auto-oriented. And the outcome that is most important is that most daily needs can be met without need for a car trip in these climate-friendly areas. What that means is that within those areas, we would need the areas to be planned to contain a high concentration of housing, jobs, businesses, and services. They also need to be served by or planned for service by high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services, right? So making those other modes of transport more viable, more attractive to folks. And to make these areas inviting and pleasant to be in, they need to be provided with shade and weather protection, other amenities, open space, that sort of thing for residents, employees, and visitors. So that is fundamentally what a climate-friendly area is. And I think Evan really described it well. A lot of these, we have these areas already. A lot of them are the older, downtown areas that we have in many of our cities. McMinnville's downtown is a good example. There's many, many others I think we could all think of. Go ahead, advance to the next slide. All right, so this is, I'm sorry, I apologize for all the detail here, but let me just talk through the information here. This is the next draft, and this gets to the options for local governments. And so the left-hand column here, the rules will apply to cities and a few urbanized county areas. For the most part, these will apply to cities, and they're organized by population size. So the first category are those smaller communities, population just over 5,000 to just under 10,000, 10,000 to 20, just under 25,000, 25 to 50, 50 to 100 basically, and then the larger ones over 100,000, which I don't believe there are any in the regions that we're speaking with today. The columns have to do with a few different categories. So for each of these cities, the first of all, the size of the climate friendly area. So there will be requirements and rules about the, how much area needs to be designated as climate friendly. For the very small communities, we're just saying they need to designate at least 25 acres. So these are relatively small cities. For the other cities, the requirement is that they need to be sized so that they could accommodate at least 30% of that housing need within the community, within the city or county, urbanized county area. That doesn't mean they need to meet 30% tomorrow. It means they need to be planned and designed so that over time we see that type of development in those climate friendly areas. And then there are two options basically for local governments. One is the prescriptive standards path. So these are basically rules that a local government could say, all right, we just want to follow the prescriptive path. We will adopt these rules into our development codes for climate friendly areas. Okay, done. The other option would be an outcome oriented standard where we're looking at basing those standards on target development levels. And that has to do with the number of homes and jobs within each net acre in those areas. So the development standards would need to be designed to meet those goals. And so really we've pared back these rules quite a bit from the first draft, and we're focusing really on minimum residential densities within these areas, so that new residential development in these areas would need to be built to meet these minimum levels of density, and then allowing for certain, building heights. So no less than 50 feet for the very smallest cities. When we get to the larger cities, there's a requirement that at least one of the climate friendly areas would allow for at least an 85-foot building. If there are other climate friendly areas, because you can have one or more than one climate friendly area, those other areas would only need to meet a 60-foot allowance. So, and again, that's allowing for buildings to be constructed to that height. So that would be the prescriptive path. On the outcome oriented standard, it's really just, okay, we need to develop a package of development standards that will achieve in the smallest communities 20 homes and jobs per net acre, in the largest communities 50 homes and jobs per net acre. So that in a nutshell is the way those rules are organized. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. In addition to that, there are some other requirements that would apply whether you follow the prescriptive path or the outcome-oriented path within those climate-friendly areas. Fundamentally, of course, is allowing mixed uses, including residential, office, retail, services, public uses. So those uses would need to be allowed within climate-friendly areas. However, there is, and this is new in draft 2, an allowance to consider or to include abutting areas with high concentrations of housing or employment to be included within those climate-friendly areas. So those might be single use, or maybe not single use, but areas that are zoned primarily for residential or employment uses. But if they have a high concentration of either type of use, then they could qualify as part of a climate-friendly area. We're also asking local governments to prioritize the locating government facilities, or some types of government facilities, those serving the public, as well as parks, open space, or similar amenities, if not currently in or near those climate-friendly areas, again, to provide that attractive, inviting environment that is so important in these areas. Also, associated with these climate-friendly areas are requirements for high-quality pedestrian, bike, transit infrastructure facilities. Also, a different set of parking standards, which Evan will speak to here in a little bit. And so I guess I said this already, but those are the basics. But again, there are two paths for local governments to follow, either the prescriptive or the outcome-based. Next slide, please. The timeline, and this is the phase timeline. So in the current draft, we would ask the local governments to designate climate-friendly areas by June 30 of 2023. As you've heard, we're anticipating rule adoption of in May of 2022. So this would allow just a little over a year for local governments to, and the designation is basically to identify those areas that they plan to zone to be climate friendly areas. But associated with that is a required analysis of equitable housing outcomes. So looking at potential underserved populations that may be impacted, and if there may be the potential for displacement or negative impacts, the identification of mitigation strategies for local governments to implement. Because of course, what we don't want to see is inequitable outcomes coming out of the climate friendly areas process. Then the requirements would require the local governments to adopt zoning and comprehensive plan amendments 1 year after the designation of the areas. So this would be to whatever those zoning standards is. It could be the prescriptive path. It could be the outcome-oriented path. They would need to adopt those and adopt comprehensive plan amendments 1 year after designating the climate-friendly areas, June 30, 2024. Also included within the climate-friendly area standards is a different transportation review process, different from what we have in current rule, which replaces what was previously an auto or car-dominated analysis with a more multimodal analysis of gaps in various transportation modes. So again, transit, pedestrian, bike infrastructure, and putting in place plans to fill those gaps with an emphasis on within climate-friendly areas, but also connections to key destinations within the community. In some circumstances, highway impacts analysis would be required in conjunction with that review as well. And I think I just have one more slide. This is the housing side of climate-friendly areas. So some of you may be familiar with the requirements of House Bill 2003, which passed, I believe it was 2019, I think it was 2019. Essentially requires cities over 10,000 in Oregon to regularly update their housing capacity analyses and subsequently to develop housing production strategies as a tool to better understand and address housing needs within those areas. The proposed amendments to the housing rule would essentially kind of embed in those requirements for those local governments that were within these metropolitan areas to also report on housing production and affordable housing production within climate-friendly areas. Housing production strategy analysis that would follow will help to identify tools to facilitate housing development in those areas. So we hope to build a kind of a resource over time with, hey, here's some things that are working really well to facilitate specifically affordable housing development in climate-friendly areas, but just in general, the level of development that we need to see if we're going to meet our climate and equity goals. The last piece has to do with UGB expansions. So the previous version, the first version of these rules, essentially said local governments after, I think it was June 30, 2026, actually would need to basically achieve 30% of their housing in climate-friendly areas in order to expand their UGBs. However, some of the commenters in the feedback that we received rightly pointed out that that could have a negative impact on housing affordability and some other not very good unintended consequences. And so we reconsidered that rule, and instead what we have in this draft is a requirement that after this date, June 30, 2027, UGB expansions that are based on residential needs will trigger additional climate-friendly area designation requirements. So they're not holding back urban growth boundary expansions. They will still be allowed to grow. Cities will still be allowed to grow. They need to grow smarter, more compactly in a way that is more climate-friendly and more equitable. And so these requirements are designed to do that. I know you may have a lot of questions. We will have plenty of time afterwards, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions on this. I think now it's on to parking. Evan.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. This is the hardest thing I do. I would normally want to talk for 6 or 8 hours about parking. I'll try to do it in a couple of minutes. So why are we taking on parking? We have a lot of parking. look at any downtown and you got a lot of off-street parking and on-street parking. And that's preventing us from meeting a lot of our goals. This is a study in Eugene where they said, oh, we could actually build 4 units of housing here if we just built 3 parking spaces instead of 4. But the code says we need 4, so we only end up with 2 housing units. So we're trading parking for other things, and preventing having a lot of free unpaid parking everywhere encourages people to drive, and that's kind of the challenge that we're taking on is too much driving. So the parking draft rules kind of do 3 things. They implement best practices. We looked across Oregon for best practices in parking codes, and we said, okay, these things we think all the communities in those metro areas should do. The second is to significantly reform parking approaches for most Oregon cities. And we have a 3-step thing. You can either say, hey, we're not going to mandate a bunch of parking. We're actually going to take out minimum parking requirements and let builders build what they think their residents need. So that's option 1. Option 2 is to reduce parking for certain types of development, and I'll get into that, and in key areas that tend to be have less demand for cars and parking. And you're more able to get around without a car, and adopt some policies that are kind of best parking policies from across the country. And the third is really do more of the types and areas and not adopt those policies. So, and the third thread of the parking rules is asking a little bit more of the most populous communities. So what sorts of types of development do we think we should reduce parking mandates? Really small units, residential units, multifamily units, we'd reduce the required parking in line with some other stuff we've done over the last year plus with missing middle housing. Affordable housing, homes and treatment facilities, people with disabilities. We think those folks will provide parking kind of across the board, but maybe not as much as they're forced to right now. Similarly, the areas where parking mandates would be reduced, those climate friendly areas, as Kevin noted, the rules say you can't provide as much, you can't force builders to build a bunch of parking, and along the priority transit corridors. And the data in parking as far as how much parking is needed is really driven by concentration of jobs and people and quality transit. So these are the 2 things that if you have those things, you don't need as much parking anyway. The other thing I'd like to mention is the rules have some draft provisions for electric vehicle charging. The state did something called the TINA study, the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis. And they said, wow, if we're really going to get to 90% of EVs by 2035 in new cars, we're going to have a bunch of EV charging. And so the draft rules say for larger parking lots, multifamily, commercial, et cetera, you have to provide capacity for 1 out of every 5 spaces. And for residential and mixed use, where most people charge, we're going to say, let's prepare to have half the spaces charged. These are only 2 pieces of the whole puzzle, but they're the pieces that are most expensive to retrofit in. So having electric capacity and conduit when you build things is a cost-efficient thing to do. Actual wiring and chargers you can put in as demand requires, but getting this right when we're building makes a lot of sense. And then there's some retrofit things for when people spend a bunch of money doing major retrofits. We ask to put in some EV infrastructure. Bill.
Thank you very much, Evan. Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Holmstrom. I'm a transportation and land use planner here at DLCD, and happy to talk with you this evening about some of the changes we're making to the transportation planning rules in order to achieve the objectives that Evan discussed at first thing in this meeting. I'll be very brief because I know we want to get to questions and discussion with all of you. So real quickly, our transportation planning rules, they've been around for a long time, actually. We've had rules in this state in Oregon that tell local governments to do coordinated land use and transportation planning. That means the transportation system, you're planning that in order to meet the needs of the community and doing that in coordination with the land use plans. Part of the Oregon land use planning program that you do coordinated, consistent planning across, parks and natural resources and land use and transportation. So as a part of that piece, we've required these for decades. Many local governments have what's called transportation system plan as part of their comprehensive plan that lays out how their transportation system is supposed to be planned over the next 20, 25 years or so. We know that we haven't been doing good enough so far. We've got all these rules. We're doing better than we would have if we didn't have these rules, but we're still not doing good enough. And a big chunk of why we're doing this entire project is because we need to make significant steps in the right direction in order to meet our climate and equity goals. So we're trying to build on what we've built over the last 20, 30 years and do more. And really, I like to say we're turning up the volume on a lot of the planning that we've already done here in Oregon. Next slide, please, Evan. So how are we going to do that? So one big piece is we're going to focus on planning even more than what's already required, which it is to plan for our pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks. When we say pedestrian, we're talking about people walking as well as people who use mobility devices. We talk about bicycle system, we talk about people using bicycles, electric bicycles, and other kind of devices of that kind of scale and speed, that a bicycle is. And then, public transportation, of course, is transit, both intercity, but as well mostly within a local community. Of course, existing plans require this already. We're trying to really say that needs to be the focus of most of our planning and prioritization moving forward. We've built out, we've done a really good job of building an excellent network for people to drive around on. You can get from here to there now. There's a few places where probably some gaps need to be filled, but by and large, if we're moving into the future and we know we expect to have less driving, each Oregonian is going to need to drive less on average in the future, then we need to be making investments in those other ways of getting around other than driving a car. So that's what our focus is going to be on. We want to make sure that each of those networks is a connected network, that it's safe for everybody that wants to use it, regardless of their age or their ability or any other characteristic they might have, and that we've got complete networks that connect to each other. Because right now, and for many of these, for all three of these types of networks, for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit networks, they're disconnected. They're missing. There's gaps. And you can't get from here to there. And so it's difficult to ask people to use other ways of getting around if it's not possible to do that, or it's dangerous to do that, or people just don't feel comfortable doing that. So that's a lot of what we're focusing on is making those systems connected, safe, and complete. When we're making investments in these places, there's a lot of work to do, a lot of gaps to fill, and it's going to take many, many years under existing funding streams in order to get to where we want to be. So we need to make priorities about what's important. We're telling local governments they need to prioritize climate-friendly areas. As Kevin noted earlier, he talked about climate-friendly areas. In order to make those work, you really need to have good ways of getting around other than having to just drive a car. Still can drive a car around them, of course, but we need to make investments in those other ways of getting around. We also want to focus in neighborhoods that have concentrations of underserved populations or have, over generations, as Evan noted earlier, there's areas where there's been generations of disinvestment or malinvestment where we haven't made these types of investments in the past. And we know that there are a range of effects in those neighborhoods that are, it's bad. That's the best way to put it. We want to be able to make sure that all Oregonians have opportunities to access jobs, access shopping, access medical appointments, access school, whatever they need to do, and not necessarily, not be able to afford a car. A car may be a big expense for a family. We want to be able to make sure that people have a lot of other ways of getting around, and that those are comfortable and safe and connected. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're connecting to key destinations in every neighborhood, in every community, to make sure that people can get to those daily things they need to get to on a regular basis without having to drive. Next slide, please. And then, and this is my last slide. Finally, we're giving local governments, when they're doing their transportation system plan, when they're updating it, they have opportunity to put together a prioritization framework for how they decide which projects are the best ones, which ones should be at the top of the list. And we've given them a variety of prioritization factors, many of which I've already talked about why should we select this project over that project. And so both within each mode, but also the whole piece altogether. And one element of this that I think is important is once local governments get to the point where they're taking, all the different projects, but everything in the kitchen sink, putting it all on one big list, nothing that they're going to be able to, it's a big list that they're not going to be able to accomplish over the next 20 years. It's just, this is the list that they're choosing from. They're going to have a list that meets their goals for reducing motor vehicle travel. And that's kind of going to be an interesting hurdle to see how that works. But that means you're going to have the balance of projects on that list is going to have to mean you're putting a lot in our pedestrian system, a lot of our bicycle system, a lot of our transit system, if you want to have even a few projects that may be highway projects or street projects that may increase the driving. So it's not saying you can't do those projects, it's saying you have to have a balance that moves things in the right direction. And then when they get into selecting those projects, of course, there's selection and prioritization factors for how that list gets put together. And that's how we determine which projects get funded over that planning period and end up getting constructed. That's how it works. One other thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how we measure success in the transportation system. This happens a lot of different ways, but there's some key ways, and this gets really wonky into transportation planning details, and I'm not going to get into it too much tonight. But basically, we have a system right now that really just looks at how many cars can we move through an intersection. And that's basically how we define success. We want to look at a range of factors that reflect all the different values that we have in our transportation system. Are we connecting communities to and neighborhoods and families to destinations? Is it safe? Are we are people who aren't driving able to get around easily? So we're trying to make it easier for local governments to figure out other ways of measuring how our transportation system is successful other than just moving a certain number of cars through an intersection over a certain amount of time. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Evan. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks, Bill. So we're about to hear from you all. I would want to note that when we first ran these numbers, which was before all of you were registered, but well, most of you were registered, we looked at the demographics, and this isn't a surprise to anyone who's been involved in public engagement. But the folks at this meeting are different than Oregon overall. It's not, there are voices missing in this room, and we via our advisory committee have kind of worked on centering the voices that are often missing. So we definitely want to hear from everyone here, and we also want folks of thinking who might not be here. So people who have disabilities or people of color, lower income folks, people who English is not the first language, lots of voices that may be missing. But just a reminder on our diversity goal as we go forward. So, but we do definitely want to hear from all of you. So we want to take maybe 5 or 10 minutes to just get some clarifying questions. This isn't your time for your opinions, or we'll get to that. So we just want to say, okay, what were you really confused with? Are there a couple of things that we can clarify before we get into hearing your thoughts and comments overall? So I will, if you want to chat, I can call on you. If you want to raise your hand. I don't know if raise your hands works. Okay, you all understand 100 pages of rules. Fabulous. You can teach me about them. No, this is great. Any questions about anything that you heard that wasn't okay? I'm hoping that you're just
how are
okay.
Are we doing this by typing into chat?
So if you have a question about just the clarifying questions, I was just trying to see who was interested in asking a clarifying question. So if you have one of those, Jimmy, you're welcome to do that. And welcome
I
to
have a whole pile of questions though, so I don't want to.
all right, choose one or two. Choose one or two, and
Oh, okay. Well, one of my concerns, I'll try and do two questions here. One of my concerns in the whole overarching picture is we're talking about 30% CFAs. And, you know, I'm working for Rogue Advocates, so we're, you know, land use advocacy. I'm thinking, gee, given what we're trying to, the hurdle we're trying to get over here, and this is basically what we call smart growth. 30% is committed to smart growth and 70% is still committed to dumb growth. That doesn't sound really good. I understand you got to start somewhere. I get that. So maybe a suggestion, an idea, is there a way, since we're talking about rule changes, to change the rules around the SDCs, the system development charges? Because the way I look at it right now, the less represented, the rent challenged and ownership challenged populace actually pay into those SDCs. That some portion of that money goes to housing, you know, building infrastructure for housing types they will never be able to afford.
okay.
And
So,
so I would say really simply, if we're going to only have 30%, maybe we can say, okay, fine, you can still do 70% the old style, but how do we disincentivize that with public funds?
Thank you, Jimmy. We'll start with that. I can take a stab at that, or happy to defer to somebody else. The system development charges overall are statutory. There are a lot of limitations on how this SDCs can be structured. We are looking at other ways to provide incentives and resources to areas that need them, working in partnership with our sister agencies, ODOT, Oregon Housing and Community Services, and that sort of folk, as well, to really try to boost that equity thing. But we do understand SDCs, and I would say on the overall 30%, 70% thing, a lot of these rules will have impacts across the community. The 30% is mainly about a goal on how much housing needs to be in CFAs. You want to add to that, Kevin? Or I see you're off mic.
Yeah, I would just to note that you know, one thing, yeah, the SDC piece is it's outside the kind of the scope of this effort. However, I am happy to report that the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department is doing a study, and I think this was a bill that passed, I'm not entirely sure, that is basically supporting an SDC study. They're very interested in the relationship between SDCs and housing affordability. We are, members of our housing team are engaged with them on that effort, and we're watching it very closely. We'll see where that goes.
Okay, we're gonna answer a couple of more of these, and then we're gonna open it up to testimony. The presentation will be available on our website later this week. And yes, Gary had asked, can a climate-friendly area include an entire city? Kevin.
Well, we all the rules are couched in terms of at least. So at least 30%, at least 25 acres. There's nothing in the rules that would preclude a local government from zoning an entire city as a climate-friendly area. We don't anticipate that. We recognize, you know, right now cities are kind of, there's a lot of the existing built environment that we're going to have for a while, and obviously we're hoping to see redevelopment and infill over time. But the reality is we are trying to change the game here, but it's going to be an incremental process that will occur with redevelopment and that kind of activity.
Yeah, just real quick, I think one thing to keep in mind with that is, you know, that 30 to 70% goal, that's where we want to be, right? But if, you know, 90 or 95% of our land or development right now is, as you call it, dumb development, then more than 30% of our new stuff is going to have to be the smart stuff in climate friendly areas. And so like what's happening from here forward, what can we actually change and how do we move the needle moving forward? A lot more of that than 30% in order to get to that 30% at the end is going to have to be that type of development.
There's a question about cap and reduce program. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. Yeah, generally, our sister agency, Department of Environmental Quality, is working on that rulemaking effort. That's a separate effort that will grab the information about that rulemaking and drop it into the chat. Yeah. Anyone, anything to add to that? Okay. Are there features specific to Southern Oregon that you've identified that distinguish it from other regions in Oregon in terms of implementing the vision you're presenting?
I'll just say, I mean, one of the things that we have heard quite a lot is, hey, we're not Portland. We know that. You know, we know that, and that, you know, the first draft of the climate friendly area stuff kind of had what I'll call one size fits all standards for all local governments, or, you know, most of the local governments. What we've tried to do with this version is to really kind of size them appropriately so that it's easier for smaller local governments to kind of bite that off, and the larger cities will have standards that are more kind of compatible with their existing standards as well.
I'd just like to note that I think outside of the Portland metro area, I think there's more cities than any other metropolitan area in the Southern Oregon, you know, the Rogue Valley MPO. So they're, you know, a pretty good track record of regional cooperation through the regional problem solving effort, urban reserves. So a lot of some of that work has been done from a land use perspective of kind of figuring out where the region, for Rogue Valley at least, wants to go in the future, and has identified kind of like the next places to go. And I believe that that's pretty unique outside of the Portland metro area. I think Eugene is working on those right now, but you know, there's, I think, a good case to be made for some of the regional approaches in our rulemaking, and a lot of those are voluntary. I think things work better at a region, and the scales of transportation and housing, and of course, Mother Nature doesn't really respect city boundaries. So those are the kind of things that I think would set the region up for success.
And the last question that we'll try to answer before we get to hearing your comments is, how do local agencies connect to funding resources efficiently? Yeah, and I guess I'll start on that. First, Governor Brown's executive order was clear that DLCD and ODOT were meant to identify resources to help local governments implement this program. And we have identified some of those resources, and we'll be rolling that out. We do have some resources through this biennium to do that. And we're hiring a staffer to help local communities do that. And again, the OHCS affordable housing funds and some ODOT funds may be earmarked for communities that are working hard to meet these rulemaking. So other people want to add to that before we open it up for comments?
Well, I'll just add that, I mean, we are already talking about future bienniums and, you know, possible, you know, requests for funding. It's at the discretion of the legislature, and we know that, you know, there are no guarantees in life, but we certainly see the need for continued support for local government implementation, and we will be active as we can be in trying to secure that support. Even if that doesn't come through, we will continue to have a TGM program, and we expect that many of those resources will help to support this effort as well. TGM stands for Transportation Growth Management, sorry. It's a joint program with ODOT and DLCD.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, there is a comment there's one last comment, but generally we want to hear from folks now on what you think about this. I'll get to Marjorie's comment. Marjorie asked Stevens, and we'll work out some of these chat things. She says, I'm concerned about baking in long-term infrastructure that goes in the wrong direction. In particular, any new natural gas pipelines and delivery should be stopped. My city's community development director says USDOT has authority over all transmission pipelines. Does ODOT have any role to play in making rules to limit natural gas transmission infrastructure development? And I'm going to go hug my kids goodnight while somebody answers that.
Yeah, hi, Marjorie. This is Bill Holmstrom. So DLCD, we don't believe we have any authority in this area. I think it's mostly going to be Public Utilities Commission or Department of Energy in terms of at the state level. Building codes probably has a piece to play in terms of how buildings work and rules around natural gas there. As far as ODOT and pipelines, I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question. And whether or not they'd be interested in taking something like that on, I'd have to guess that we're pretty far down their list, but I don't want to speak for them. So.
Thank you, Bill. I'm sure it was brilliant. Awesome. So yeah, now we just want to kind of get your reaction to what you've heard tonight or what you've read online or from the emails. Kind of anyone who wants to take 3 minutes and kind of let us know what you're excited about this, the rulemaking, or what things concern you, and thoughts on making those work better for you and your communities while we keep trying to meet our climate and equity goals. So this is a small enough group. We're not going to do breakout room. We're just going to open up the mic, and I'll keep timing. Kevin will take notes. So yeah, I had heard that. Got in a text. Gabriela, would you like to start us off?
Sure, yeah. Hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much for opening up for the community to speak and understand more about the rules. I want to say that I do appreciate that the importance of parks are being recognized by the rules. Kevin Young talked a lot about parks in the climate-friendly areas, and I do appreciate that. I see that parks tie in the other goals as well. It is a cost-effective way to mitigate climate change. It promotes equitability because it helps the most vulnerable people to access a place to recreate, be in contact with nature. It also helps these vulnerable populations to adapt to the climate change, to the effects of climate change that are inevitable. And as it was mentioned by Bill, I believe that with the connectivity, parks and trails also promote alternative ways for people to transport and walk around. I would, my concern is I would like to see more teeth when it comes to park and open spaces. I do see, for instance, that talking about housing, there are very specific regulations that are being proposed in terms of the building heights and other standards that these buildings need to be. And I think it would be, I believe it's possible to do a similar thing when it comes to parks. So have more specific rules and standards and requirements for cities to not only preserve our existing parks and open spaces, but also expand, because as I said, I believe parks and open spaces in urban settings are crucial for many, many different goals. we see across the state and possibly the country that parks and open spaces are being taken and converted into other land uses, such as housing. And I believe housing is a very important issue that needs to be addressed. But when we're converting parks and open spaces to resolve one issue, we're creating another issue. So I think it is very important that the agencies communicate among themselves, so we don't create issues in order to resolve another one. I'm going to give an example. The city where I live, Hood River, the city was selling one of our local parks for $1 for a developer to build houses. And if it wasn't for the community to get together and try to save this park, we would have lost this park, which is in the heart of town, and it's the only forested park. Anyways, I think I'm getting too long here. I want to give space for other people to talk. But yeah, I would like to see more teeth when it comes to conserving and expanding parks and open spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Hannah, you're next in line.
Hey, thank you all for organizing this meeting and for helping to kind of educate me as to what's going on in this respect. I actually really had no idea before I came into this meeting. I'm a lifelong commuter cyclist, and so I'm really excited to hear that alternative modes of transportation are really at the center of all this, as it obviously should be. I'm also really excited to hear that in the Rogue Valley, that there seems to be some cooperation in terms of kind of local population centers and governments, hopefully planning to work together in order to build kind of larger infrastructure in that respect. One of the things that I want to make sure happens when it comes to cycling infrastructure is that infrastructure is built in such a way that everyone feels comfortable kind of getting onto the road. I feel like a lot of cycling infrastructure is basically like, let's put down some bike lanes and make sure that, you know, there's bike options kind of out there on any given road. But I think maybe prioritizing things like protected bike lanes so that people who are perhaps a little bit less confident on their bike might feel encouraged to get out there and you know, try it out, see how it feels to, say, cycle to the supermarket or whatever. I know that that's expensive, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be something that happens on every road, but I think at least prioritizing it in the kind of main arterial context would be wonderful to hear. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And that's a good lead into another question that we got that we'll answer before we get to Jimmy. So Jimmy, after we talk a little bit about the proposed details of how we're doing bike and ped friendly stuff and design, we'll go to Jimmy. So Bill, you want to talk a little bit more about the details?
Yeah, real quick. So if people want to read the rules on this, we have the draft rules on our website. This is in the transportation planning rules, or division 12. And if you look at the new rules for how pedestrian system planning will happen are, it's rule, let me think about this, 510, and then bicycle planning would be 610. So we've struggled a little bit with figuring out how this works at the rule level. So the rules set out how local governments do transportation system planning, right? And we've tried to put a balance between being strong about what specifically we want to see without being overly prescriptive and, you know, laying out you have to have a bike lane that's exactly 5 feet wide or whatever the thing is. We can't get into that level of detail. So we've really tried to say, local governments, prioritize those streets which are the fastest and busiest, give them the most protection. Those arterials that are big, have a lot of traffic on them, they need to be separated. They need to have separation for those pedestrian facilities. They need to have wide sidewalks. They need to have wide, comfortable, protected cycling facilities. We did get a lot of pushback in particular on, you know, requiring protected bicycle facilities. I'm of the opinion personally that those are critical to making sure that we have a bicycling network that is open to a wide variety of people. We need more people riding bicycles than just the people that are riding them now, right? So we need to make those attractive to more people, and a lot of people don't feel safe in our current lanes that are just striped with a line. So there need to be higher levels of protection, especially on those larger facilities, particularly in climate-friendly areas. We're putting particular interest in making sure those climate-friendly areas have levels of protection. But we don't get into a super high level of detail saying it has to be this wide, it has to be this much protection, has to be look exactly like this. That's the general question. If you want to see the details in there, there are going to be some people who think we've gone too far, some people who don't think we've gone far enough. We're trying to hit a balance here of letting jurisdictions meet a range of needs while still trying to advance where we need to be in order to get more people walking in on those bicycle and transit networks.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to go to Jimmy, and after Jimmy, Gary. Other people can chat at me and get in line.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say I am really, really appreciative that this process is going on. I am very, very, very happy. Wish it had started a long time ago. I was in the Bear Creek Regional Problem Solving process. We could not talk about climate change that, politically speaking, was not allowed in the room. Well, maybe it feels like a day late and a dollar short, or many so, but at least we're getting to it now. My prior comment was aimed at this idea of, are these seemingly big plans here short, considering how you showed that first graph where here's where we plan to be, but here's where we actually are, nowhere close. Is this, I don't want the word aggressive, is this ambitious enough? And I realize there's politics here involved, so not expecting the moon and the stars, but nonetheless, how do you arrive at the 30%? Is that, is that a realistic goal? Will that actually get us to where we need to go? Or will it just barely get us? Because usually big plans don't really work out all the way. Another thing is, let me ask right off, is there a way to write comments in and so that I can, do my laundry list? That would be great to know that. And also the thing about scenario planning that you mentioned with the regional plans idea, can that be implemented into urban growth boundary expansion exercises? I think it should be at that level as well. Maybe I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you. Casaria had put the contact info to submit comments. I will repeat it in the chat as well. So, yes. and we'll capture what you wrote in the chat as well, Gabriela. Thank you. Gary.
Good evening. I wanted in some ways to respond back to Bill and his statements regarding the necessity of ensuring that bicycle facilities in the state are in fact built consistent to serve all ages and abilities. Unfortunately, the 1991 rule, the transportation planning rule, required only bike lanes on arterial and collector streets. Regrettably, that will be the core of our current system for decades, because we'll be largely going back and retrofitting those facilities. Two, many of those existing bike lanes are overly narrow. We can look at the FHWA or Oregon Department of Transportation standards for bikeways or bike lanes, and they show 5 feet typically as the recommended width. Yet there are bike lanes virtually throughout the state, maybe with notable exceptions in some jurisdictions, that are 2 to 3 feet wide, which is the problem with the department's approach to protected bike lanes not being described by their width. importantly, as we move forward, we will see an increasing diversity of speeds in those bike lanes, given that there are electric bikes that can easily cruise 20 miles an hour and push scooters that probably get up to maybe 5. It's essential that bike lanes provide for passing distance between different users. Otherwise, bike riders or others will have to merge into the traffic lane. If it's a protected bike lane, then that option isn't available, and they consequently will become largely useless. One of the things, and Bill, if I'm reading in later or an earlier version of the rules, I read this afternoon that the protected bike lanes were limited to arterial and collector streets on climate-friendly areas or in climate-friendly areas. And the recommendation, again, of the version of the rules that I read said that buffered bike lanes would be acceptable in all our other areas. I believe that's a strategic mistake, and one like the 1999 transportation planning rule requirement providing for bike lanes will regret, because without protected bike lanes on all arterial and collector streets, the network is disconnected and dysfunctional, much like it is today. In conclusion, protected bike lanes are needed on any street that has volumes greater than 2,500 or speeds greater than 25 miles an hour. That's what the National Association of City Transportation Officials included in their publication, Designing for All Ages and Abilities. And it is my opinion that the department should adhere to that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate that. All right. Hannah's not raising her hand. You're just applauding. All right, fabulous. Thank you. I do want to give an opportunity for people on the phone only. I realize that you're not able to chat perhaps at us. If one of the 3 people on the phone wants to say anything, feel free to unmute and talk. Oh, Casaria says you can press *9 to raise your hand. Casaria knows everything. Okay, I'm not seeing any.
And they may need to know, Evan, what the star number is to unmute themselves as well, because they're muted in Zoom, not just on the, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute all, well, whatever. I'm gonna see if I'm asking all of you to unmute and seeing if that works. Okay, all right. Fine, maybe you're listening in. I don't mean to push anyone to share their thoughts if they'd rather just listen. Okay, we've had a lot of people talk. I don't see anyone else in line. Do other people want to share thoughts or ask questions, ask additional questions? We know we've pushed a lot at you tonight.
This is Samantha on the phone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so one of the questions I guess have, and I don't know if it would be in your guys' realm or pushed down, but I was thinking like with the bike transportation issue specifically, and as Gary just brought up, e-bikes are becoming ever more popular. I know one of the issues in our community is people that are out a little more rural that need to, get a certain distance and then bike home or move town to town can't take e-bikes on the public transportation system. And that becomes a big barrier for those people that really want or need to be, non-automobile drivers for those underprivileged communities. So that is something that this group would even be addressing, or is that something that needs to go to another like committee or group?
Yeah, Bill, I mean, transit, we don't have a lot. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, frankly, that's probably an operational decision having to do with the public transportation provider. So probably RVTD if you're in Jackson County, and that's outside of our authority. Our rules really talk about how cities and counties plan for transportation networks and the details of how that's implemented, particularly around transit. That's really down to that transit provider. So their policies around what they can or can't do with e-bikes it's outside of our realm of authority, unfortunately. Sorry.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and we do have some provisions to encourage or to make sure there's charging in bike parking areas, because we realize electrification is coming to various bikes and other things that would be in those areas, but that's kind of as much as lies in our authority. So, all right, any other questions? Oh, I've got a hand up from a 9819 that ends in 9819. You want to go?
This is Stuart Leibowitz. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for your commitment to dealing with the climate crisis and the ideas and the rules that you've forwarded. Just a couple of comments here. I like the idea of EV charging stations on multifamily. I was a multifamily grant writer for a nonprofit for 20 years, and this is an area that low-income people don't have access to, and this would be a really great way of making that happen. I also like the idea of outcome-based results in terms of giving flexibility. The only cautionary note that I would have is that it needs to be monitored closely, so the types of efforts that are being forwarded really do match ultimate outcomes in this regard. The only other thing I would mention is that transit, bike, and pedestrian plans are very much suitable for short trips. And I think an emphasis in that area would be my.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Okay. Well, our time is almost up, but if you would like to attend additional community conversations, you could join in after the presentation. We're having 3 more of those this week. Hear what other folks from around the state are saying or thinking. The people who presented tonight presented about the rules that they're working on, so you're welcome to track us down. We're on the DLCD website. You can write testimony in. You can also testify directly to the commission. There will be four commission meetings between now and adoption. The dates are here. The commission are the people who are going to make the final decisions on these rules. We leave it up to Commissioner Warren and his colleagues to make the tough decisions. So feel free to reach out to the commission or testify at a commission meeting. Anyone else with last questions before Commissioner Warren closes?
This is Samantha again.
Yep.
Not really a question so much as I know we already brought up the bike lanes, but I kind of just want to go ahead and third that just from the standpoint of the handicap community as well. I've got a good friend and some other friends tangentially from her that are wheelchair bound folks. And she's a very heavy user of our greenway down here in the Rogue Valley, and would never think about going on some of those traditional bike lanes in the city streets just because of those barriers things. So as we think about how these rules affect underserved communities, again, just throwing that out there as a perspective, I don't think people think about wheelchairs using those as readily, but with the electrification, those hand crank wheelchairs are becoming really popular. And I think that'll continue to expand and give that community more opportunities, infrastructure as well.
I really appreciate that comment. Thank you. Gary, you have your hand up.
I wanted to just comment on the transportation prioritization framework, and more particularly a provision in that identifies improving safety, particularly reducing or eliminating fatalities and serious injuries as a high priority project. And while I don't disagree with the approach, it would seem to me that if the state is actually interested in seeing increasing numbers of people walking and biking, that provision should specifically focus on vulnerable road users as contrasted to simply automobile drivers, which to my thinking would provide the justification for innumerable highway project improvements, which would consequently make it impossible to get to the kind of bike and pedestrian improvement network improvements that are needed. So again, the priority needs to be on reducing the fatalities and serious injuries to vulnerable users as contrasted to auto drivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah. Hopefully it's everyone, but that's a nuance well taken, and so we will consider that. So yeah, with that, I will turn it to Commissioner Warren once again.
Thanks, Evan, and thank you everyone for showing up tonight. It means a lot, and I'm hearing the bicycle thing definitely as a fellow cyclist, and it's crazy out there. So we definitely need to build more infrastructure that makes us all safer as we commute to work or grocery store or wherever it is we're going. So we'll definitely be thinking about that on the commission, and I'll make sure to represent that conversation as well. And I also want to invite you all to attend these commission meetings. There's space for public comments there. So if you didn't get a chance to say something tonight, or something pops in your brain in the middle of the night tonight, please come tell us at the next meeting. And we also have these with 3 more community conversations this week. So you can find the information for those on our website. And I encourage you to tell your friends about it and get them to show up for it as well. So thank you all. We appreciate it, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you.